Story 1. Walking home alone. It was the middle of autumn when this happened, and I was still living in the small town where I grew up. I was 20 at the time, working part-time at a cafe downtown. My shifts usually ended before sunset, but that night, a coworker called out sick, and I had to stay late to help close. By the time I walked out of the cafe, it was close to 11 p.m. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet where you feel like you shouldn't even talk out loud. The walk from the cafe to my apartment wasn't long, maybe 15 minutes if I cut through the side streets. I usually took the main road, but that night I figured the shortcut would be quicker, and all I wanted was to get home, shower, and sleep. Looking back, I regret that decision. As I walked, the cool air carried the faint smell of wet leaves. My footsteps echoed louder than usual on the cracked pavement. I remember checking my phone, scrolling through messages, when I noticed something. Behind me, about half a block away, there was a man walking. At first, I didn't think much of it. People walk at night. It's not unusual, okay? But then I noticed that when I slowed down to tie my shoe, he slowed too. When I crossed the street a few seconds later, he crossed as well. A nervous feeling settled in my stomach. I tried telling myself it was just coincidence, but I couldn't ignore the tension crawling up my spine. My footsteps grew faster, sharper. I shoved my phone in my pocket and kept walking. Every few seconds, I glanced over my shoulder. The man was closer now, tall, wearing a hooded sweatshirt with the hood up, hands buried in his pockets. His pace matched mine almost perfectly. At the time I turned down the narrow residential street toward my apartment, my chest was tight with fear. Okay, I told myself, don't panic, just walk normal. Get inside, lock the door, and it'll be fine. But then I heard it, footsteps, quickening behind me. I froze for half a second before forcing myself to keep walking. My mouth was dry, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then I heard a voice, low, almost casual. Hey. I didn't respond. My instincts screamed not to. Hey, wait up, he called again. The sound of his footsteps got louder, closing the distance. I was almost at my building. Let's go. I could see the porch light glowing at the end of the street, like a beacon. My legs carried me faster without even thinking, almost jogging now. Hey, I'm talking to you. This time his voice was sharp, irritated. I yanked my keys out of my pocket, fumbling with them as my building came into reach. My hands shook so badly I dropped them once, and the metallic clatter on the sidewalk nearly broke me. I scrambled to grab them, heart racing, aware that the man was right behind me now. I could hear his breathing. I shoved the key into the lock, turned it, and slipped inside, just as his footsteps hit the bottom step of the porch, without even thinking. I slammed the heavy wooden door shut and threw the deadbolt. Silence. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the door, trying to calm myself. I didn't dare look through the peephole. For maybe a full minute, everything was quiet, except for the sound of my own shaky breathing. Then, tap, 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 slow, deliberate knocks on the other side of the door. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming. The knocks weren't loud, just soft taps, almost playful. Why'd you run? the man's muffled voice called. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. He stayed there for what felt like forever, tapping on the door every so often, muttering things I couldn't make out. I gripped my phone so hard my hand hurt, but I was too terrified to even call anyone. What if speaking made him more aggressive? Finally, after what must have been 10 minutes, the noises stopped. I didn't hear footsteps leaving. I didn't hear a door close, just silence. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an hour before finally daring to creep up to the peephole. My stomach dropped when I saw nothing. The porch was empty. The street was still, as if he had vanished. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the old apartment building made me jump. Every shadow outside my window felt like him standing there, watching. The next morning, I left for work earlier than usual. As I stepped out onto the porch, I noticed something carved into the wooden railing. It hadn't been there the day before. One word, scratched deep into the wood with something sharp. Run. That was the last straw. Reported it to the police, but without a face, without evidence, there was nothing they could do. To this day, I don't know who that man was or why he followed me home. But sometimes, when I'm walking alone at night, I swear I still hear those footsteps behind me, slow and steady, waiting for me to turn around. In the mall, this happened to my cousin, Sarah. She was 17 at the time and loved going to the mall with her friends. It was one of those suburban malls with a few anchor stores, a food court that always smelled like fries, and a fountain in the middle where people took selfies. For her, it was a safe place, crowded, bright, and familiar. She knew the security guards, the regulars who worked at the kiosks, and the layout so well she could navigate it without looking at a map. That Saturday began like any other. She and two friends wanted to hang out, try on clothes, and grab a late lunch. They arrived around noon, music playing in the background, and shoppers moving in gentle tides. Sarah was wearing headphones when they walked in, but she took them out once they got to the first store so they could talk. They spent the first hour trying on jackets and laughing at ridiculous outfits. Sarah remembers how light it felt, the normal kind of laughter that comes from being around people you've known since middle school. None of them thought anything of the man she would later tell us about. He was just background, a silhouette among many. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when they split up to browse different stores, that she noticed him. She was in a smaller boutique, leaning over a rack of sweaters, when she glanced up and saw him move past the doorway. He was wearing a plain jacket and a baseball cap. Nothing unusual. He had his hands in his pockets and his head down like he was on a mission. She didn't think much of it at first. But then he appeared across the aisle, looking at a display of belts. When she walked to another rack, he moved a few steps and stopped where she had been. It was subtle, almost easy to miss. But the hair on the back of her neck prickled. She told herself to relax. Malls are full of people. Coincidences happen. Maybe he was shopping too. After the boutique, Sarah met her friends at the food court. They ordered smoothies and sat on the low chairs under the skylight. She told them about the fitting room she'd been in and that she'd seen a guy who seemed to move in the same pattern as her. Her friend Mia laughed. Creepy, Mia said. Maybe he liked your jacket. Sarah forced a smile, trying not to let the worry grow. She avoided the idea that the man might be intentionally following her. They left the food court for another store, a big department place where Sarah liked the shoe section. But the feeling wouldn't go away, okay? Every time she turned a corner, she saw that jacket, okay? In the cosmetics area, near the perfume testers, he loitered. At the shoe department, he browsed the display on the opposite side of the aisle. Each time, he never came close enough to say anything. He just kept that distance, always in sight, never in reach. By the time she texted me later that night, she was quiet. I feel like someone's been behind me the whole day, she wrote. Not in a crowded way, like he's following me from store to store. I told her to tell a store employee or security. She said she didn't want to make a scene. That's what teens do. They don't want their parents to know they're being paranoid. Okay, her friends agreed. Let S not freak out. Maybe he is just weird. They tried to shrug it off and kept shopping. The mall was busy in the late afternoon. The stores were full of people, ready for the weekend. That crowd is a strange kind of protection. It makes you feel anonymous, hidden in plain sight. Maybe that's why the man kept following. A person can slip through a crowd without drawing attention. It went on all day. At one point, Sarah ducked into a photo booth near the arcade with her friend Jess to snap a silly strip of pictures. While they were inside, they could see through the little window a portion of the hall. In the top right corner of the tiny square of glass, the man's shoulder moved past. He didn't look in. He simply walked by. Sarah felt that prick again and told Jess, who tried to laugh it off. Seriously, you're being too dramatic, Jess said, but she clenched her jaw in a way Sarah could see. They finally decided to leave. The mall's LED signs flashed closing soon, and an overhead voice announced that the mall would be closing in 30 minutes. People started heading for the doors, families with shopping bags and employees waving goodbye. As they passed the anchor store near the west exit, Sarah caught a glimpse of him standing by the restrooms. He looked like he was waiting for something. She saw his head turn toward her and hold there for a beat, as if he recognized her. But then he turned away and pushed open a door marked "Employees Only." That made Sarah's stomach drop. The employees only door went into a narrow hallway with utilities and a back stairwell. It was the sort of place that led to storage rooms and supply closets, she told her friends. He just went in through the staff door. They paused at the escalator, and her friend Mia said, "Maybe he works here?" "No," Sarah said before she could stop herself. "He's not wearing a badge. He just went in." They took the escalator down, pushing through the exit doors into the cool evening air. The parking lot was full of headlights and the distant hum of engines. But the thought of him going behind the employee door gnawed at her. At home that night, Sarah tried to say it was nothing, but she couldn't sleep. Kept picturing his jacket, his cap, the way he would stand and watch. Skipped thinking of that staff entrance and the possibility that he had found a way to follow her without drawing attention. The next morning, she texted me a picture she'd taken with her friends, a grainy snapshot from the photo booth. She circled the top right corner. If you squinted, a small blur that might be a shoulder was visible. That was all she had. No face, no clear sign. She decided to go back to the mall the next weekend, not to shop, but to figure out if she was being paranoid. When I asked why she was going, she told me, "I need to know. I need to see if he's still there." This time, she went alone, telling her parents she was meeting a friend, but diverting halfway and slipping quietly into the mall. It was early afternoon. The place felt different on a weekday. Quieter employees on less frantic schedules. Sarah had a plan. She would avoid the stores he had been in and watch the hallways. She would sit by the fountain and wait. She texted me, "I'm doing this. If you don't hear from me in an hour, call Mom." I told her I would. Her hand shook when she sent it. An hour passed without incident. She walked past the old boutique where she'd first seen him. No one of note. She detoured into the bookstore and pretended to browse the travel section while peering between shelves. People moved around her like currents in slow water. She told herself she was imagining it, that stress and adrenaline had turned coincidence into a pattern. Then, at the edge of the children's play area, she saw him, standing by the kiosk that sold phone chargers and cheap sunglasses, eyes scanning the crowd. Okay, he was the same. Jacket, cap, hands in pockets. She watched him for a moment, and he didn't look at the many kids and parents nearby. He looked at the exits, the hallways, the places with fewer cameras. She ducked down an aisle in the electronics store and watched him through the display of headphones. He moved like he always did, just enough in sight to be noticed, not enough to be stopped. She felt a cold, hollow feeling in her chest. She stepped out and trailed him, close enough to keep him in view, but not so close he'd notice. He walked through a clothing store and paused in front of a mirror. He adjusted his cap, and for a second she thought she could see his face. But the brim shadowed him, and the reflection in the mirror showed only the back of his head and the angle of his jaw. He left the store and walked toward the food court. As he passed the food court, he slowed, turned his head the way someone does when they hear a familiar sound. A child began to cry. A cart rattled. A phone rang. He looked toward the fountain. That movement made Sarah do something she regrets to this day. She ducked around a pillar and approached him. "Excuse me?" she said, voice low so it wouldn't carry. He didn't respond. "Excuse me." She tried again, louder. He turned. For a split second, she saw his face. Eyes like empty glass. No smile, no expression. She felt like she'd stared into a mirror that wanted to see her fear. "Can I help you?" she asked. He tilted his head and finally spoke, his voice low and almost friendly. "No," he said, "just looking." Something about the way he said it, too casual, too flat, set her teeth on edge. She told herself to back away, to leave, but he took 2 steps that closed the distance between them. Not aggressive steps, measured steps, the kind a predator takes to position himself. He turned and began to walk, not away from her now, but in the opposite direction, as if to show disinterest. She followed. She wanted to go to security. She wanted to scream. Instead, she kept following him. Maybe that was the wrong move. Maybe That's what makes the story worse. But she wanted proof. She wanted to know. He went into a jewelry store. The glass cases reflected the bright lights and made everything look like it belonged in a movie. He moved slowly past the cases. Then he stopped at the far corner by a small glass door labeled stock and put his hand on the handle. There wasn't a badge on his jacket. He pushed the door open and disappeared inside. Sarah waited by the register. A man in a suit looked up at her and asked if he could help. She lied, said she was looking for a bracelet, and tried to swallow the panic. The man returned a few minutes later with a small tray of rings and asked if she'd like to try them on. She shook her head and made an excuse, then slipped around the counter and peered through the stock door. The stock room was narrow with metal shelves. On the far wall was a ladder leading to a catwalk that went over the loading bay. It looked like a service corridor where employees moved inventory. The security camera in the corner filmed the entrance at an angle. She could see the live feed on a small monitor near the register. On that tiny screen, the stockroom looked still. No one was in it. She stepped inside anyway. The door clicked shut behind her. The air smelled of cardboard and polish. She walked down the narrow path and looked up the ladder. The catwalk led to a door that opened into another long hall with printers and boxes. Everything looked empty. Then she heard a noise behind her, the soft scuff of hands on concrete. She turned fast, heart hammering, and the breath left her. There was a pair of shoes, hers, in front of her, and another set, a size larger, muddy, pressed irregularly into the dust near the shelving. The shoes were pointing the wrong direction, as if whoever had worn them had been turned around. She crouched down and her hands shook as she touched the mud. It was fresh and gritty. She could smell a hint of cigarette and something metallic like oil. Someone had been here, and not long ago. She went back to the register. The salesman asked if she'd found what she wanted. Her voice trembled as she said no. She asked to see footage. He frowned. "We don't, usually," he began, but then his expression changed as he looked at her. "Why?" he asked. She explained in a rush. The man, the following, the stock door. He called security on his radio. Within minutes, a uniformed guard arrived, looking serious. He took her description and promised to check cameras in the back in the service corridors. They led her into a narrow office with a monitor and playback controls. The grainy footage showed the mall's hallways, the fountain, the escalator. They played the feed from the time she'd seen him. There he was, the jacket, the cap, the hands in the pockets. He moved through the frame like a low tide, passing stores, never stopping long enough to be interviewed, never getting too close to anyone. He paused outside the jewelry store and then slipped through the stock door. The officer rewound and sped up the footage. The screen blurred when they followed the stockroom camera. For a long moment, they saw nothing, just the empty shelves and the catwalk. Then, in a frame that lasted only a heartbeat, a shadow zipped across the top of the ladder and vanished from view. The officer squinted. "Can we see the camera above the catwalk?" Sarah asked. They searched the recorded footage for the feed from that camera. There was a gap in the timeline. 10 minutes in the recorded time frame were missing. The officer explained that sometimes cameras cut out due to maintenance or a glitch, but he also said he'd log it and make note of it. He promised to patrol the service areas more that day. Sarah felt sick. Missing footage meant someone had either tampered with the system or luck had simply been on the side of a person who knew what they were doing. The officer took her statement and told her to avoid the mall for a while. He offered to escort her to her car. She accepted. That night, she lay awake thinking about the stockroom and the ladder to the catwalk. The idea that someone could slip above the stores and move unseen. She kept thinking of his face that had no expression and that one flash of his head in the photo booth. She dreamed of being watched from above. A week later, the mall announced that someone had been arrested in a neighboring county for petty theft related to stolen merchandise passing through a ring of fences. They said it wasn't connected to anything else, and in the press release, they mentioned nothing about stockrooms or missing footage. The mall's management seemed relieved and promised heightened security. Sarah stopped going to the mall. She said she didn't want to keep reliving it, and that staying away felt safer. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave her. She would walk past store windows and reflexively check behind her. She went out at night. She kept 2 well-lit streets. She told her parents everything, and, for a time, they sat with her when she was too anxious to be alone. Months went by. Life settled into a cautious routine. She found another place to hang out with friends, and the mall felt like a place from her past that belonged to someone else. Scared, the memory of the man lost its sharp edges and became a dull ache instead of a bright pain. One evening, almost a year after the incident, she went to a friend's birthday party. They met at a small diner near downtown and later moved to the friend's house, where a few people sat in the living room and talked softly. Around midnight, someone put on a slideshow of pictures from the past year, birthdays, holidays, and random selfies. Sarah watched, smiling at the images of friends. Then, a photo popped up, a snapshot from a casual afternoon at the community center a few months earlier. It showed Sarah and 2 friends at a table with coffee cups. At the edge of the frame, hardly noticeable, was a sliver of a jacket, and a cap in the doorway behind them was the same jacket. Her stomach dropped. She froze in her seat. She leaned closer and squinted. The cap brim shadowed the face, and you could barely make out an outline. But there, in that doorway, was the man. She leaned back, a cold sweat spreading across her neck. He had been in photos taken months apart, showing up without being noticed. He'd been present in spaces she'd considered safe. He'd shadowed her in more ways than one. No one at the party knew who he was. No one had a memory of him being at that community event. She kept thinking of his footsteps, of the way he'd moved from store to store. Always at a distance, always in the corners of shots and in the blind spots of cameras. She thought about the missing footage above the jewelry store and the clerk's blank expression when she'd asked to see tapes. Months later, after she had mostly forgotten his face again, Sarah went through boxes of old photos she kept in a drawer. She found a printout from that day in the photo booth, 4 small frames with ridiculous poses. In the last frame, someone's shoulder passed behind him. It was a blur, but it was there. She noticed something else too. A picture from a family picnic a year before that had a blurry figure in the background near the trees. Nothing conclusive, nothing that could be presented as proof. That's what made it so maddening. It was always there in the margins. A smudge, a shadow, a jacket, just beyond the focal point. She filed those pictures away and tried to move on. But one night, she got a text from her friend Jess. "Do you ever think about him?" It was a simple question. Sarah stared at it a long time before answering, and then replied, "All the time." A few nights after that, she came home late from work. She walked up the same quiet street where she had once passed the man on the mall walkway. As she reached the corner, she felt the same prickle along the back of her neck. She turned. There was someone across the road, half hidden in the shadow of a hedgerow, not clearly visible, just a silhouette. Teat, her heart hammered. She pulled out her phone, and the person moved, almost as if sensing movement. When she raised the flashlight app, the silhouette vanished. She called out, but no one answered. She ran the rest of the way home, locked the door, and stood against it for a long time. She thought about the photos, the footage gaps, the stockroom. She thought about the way a person could slip through a crowded place and remain a ghost. Months passed. Sarah grew more cautious. She checked over her shoulder more often, locked doors sooner, avoided wearing headphones in public. She told herself she was safer now, that the man had eventually left or found some other person to follow. But every photograph she took had a momentary pause where she checked her surroundings. Every time the camera shutter clicked, she wondered if he would be in the corner of the frame. The last thing she told me about him was small and weird. She found a note tucked behind a magnet on her fridge 3 weeks after the silhouette in the hedgerow. It was a scrap of paper folded in half with one word written in block letters. Here, no signature, no date, just that single cruel word. She threw the note out. She thought about getting the police involved again, but figured the note would mean nothing without a face attached to it. No license plate, no eyewitness. She was tired of the waiting, tired of the feeling that someone always watched her. Sometimes she sees him in reflected windows, just a flash of the cap, a line of a jacket, and she wonders how long he had been nearby without anyone ever seeing. The mall incident taught her that a person can be invisible in the middle of a crowd. They can be the smudge in the corner of a photo. They can be the gap in a security feed. To this day, she doesn't know who he was, what he wanted, or whether he ever followed someone else after her. The photos are grainy and inconclusive.